Just so you know where I come from, this is for those who don't know it, so first of all, I'm getting nerd goosebumps right now. I mean it. It's a real pleasure to meet with you people. Until Rachel bumped into me at a conference in Maastricht in May, I'd never heard of you, and I'm thrilled about what's happening. I'm not kidding, I'll make the case that we are on the verge of a convergence of big changes that make important new things possible. And one of the perspectives I will speak from is the perspective of the people who have the problem in the first place for which the industry exists. It is the patients, and there is a woman, I don't have time to tell her whole story, phenomenal woman named Regina Holiday, whose husband died. I guess I won't be able to use that, but the part of the misery of his death was that the data from one hospital couldn't get to the hospital that he had moved to. And after he died, she was a poor woman in Washington, D.C. She said the only resource she had really was her paintbrushes. And she started painting people's medical stories on jackets for free if they would wear them to conferences, because it starts conversations. She realized so many people are walking around with a healthcare disaster story or success story inside, and we don't see each other. She's done over 400 of these jackets now. She's gone on to become an ordained minister. She welcomes anybody to do one, and my wife decided to do this for me a couple of years ago as a companion to the one she did, Regina herself did. And now we are way off plan, because that's what I do. I am improv, if nothing else. This is a comment made by a patient in a survey of the Pew Research Center around 2006. They were talking to patients who are, at that time, were getting treatment and being surveyed about their experience of healthcare, but they're saying, I'm trying to tell you something, you're not hearing me. All right, and you'll see the significance of that, because I think this is changing. The term e-patient was conceived by this guy, Tom Ferguson, who died in 2006. I never crossed paths with him. And he had a gang of crazies who were his followers. The one on the top left helped save my life, and the one in the middle is my primary care physician. I was lucky enough when I got my bad news, my diagnosis, that my primary physician knew the other guy, and they knew of new ways to get things done. Ferguson coined this term, e-patients, equipped, engaged, empowered, enabled. And there, he said e-patient is to patient as email is to mail. And this was back in the early 2000s. At diagnosis, it was not pretty. These were my tumors. I had stage 4 kidney cancer, and the best available data said that my median survival was 24 weeks. This was in January of 2007. Obviously, statistics leave room for exceptions, and my mom told me I was exceptional. What can I say? It wasn't just luck, though, okay? And it's really, really important. I'm sure some of you have had a diagnosis of this general sort. You can choose to sit back and say, I hope the geniuses save my life. You can also choose to say, how can I help? And that gets into the question of what does it take to enable you to help? And that's what we're going to be talking about here. All right. Here's that crazy man. This guy, he's a good friend, so I am free to say he is a crazy French Jew who lives in New York City and Miami. And he has wild ideas, and back in the 90s, His name is Gilles Friedman. Back in the 90s, his wife had metastatic breast cancer, and he found a plain old plain text listserv, and he thought, this is nuts. These messages are being discarded. Nobody had come up with the idea yet of archives. So he did that, and then he expanded it to now acor.org has gone on and become other things. But because my doctor happened to know him, he referred me to a network of kidney cancer patients who, it turns out, had legitimate information that didn't exist in the medical literature. All right? Part of the mystery of culture change is figuring out what are the beliefs that are out there that are making people say, well, no, don't do that. That doesn't make sense. But beliefs that are wrong. All right? And it helped save my life. Long story short, remember, 24 weeks was my median survival in January of 2007. There's a CAT scan showing one of the 5 metastases I had in both lungs, and there is that metastasis. 50 weeks later, they didn't have to cut me open. I got an early immunotherapy. Now, this early immunotherapy is great stuff, except big problem. Most hospitals wouldn't use it because it was too difficult to manage. And it usually doesn't work. 85% of patients, it just went right through you. And of those who do respond, 4% die from the side effects. All right, now, what are you going to do? You or a loved one is probably dying. There is one chance to survive, and it might kill them quicker. What do you do? I did something weird. I said to the oncology team, how do I prepare for these side effects? Now, this is what today we call being an engaged patient. Now, if you find yourself thinking, what the heck, what do I know about oncology? There's nothing I can do. That phrase, there's nothing I can do, is the embodiment of being disempowered. Now, merely saying, what can I do, doesn't mean you can leap tall buildings in a single bound. I'm just pointing to the principle of being empowered and engaged versus passive. I'm also not blaming anyone who wants to sit back. That's a personal choice. I'm just teaching this issue. Anyway, immunotherapy, when it works, is phenomenal. I was one of the lucky ones, and they didn't have to cut me open to get rid of all those tumors that were all over my body. Now, as it happens, my hospital was the first one to announce that they had a working interface to that old Google Health thing that you heard about earlier. And it turns out they didn't. What they had done was they had released something without ever testing it and declared victory. And I tried it, and it didn't work, and I couldn't get a straight answer from them, so I blogged about it, and I ended up in the newspaper, and people started asking me to give speeches. It was very strange. And as a result of the speeches, I ended up testifying in Washington. First time I showed up, I mean, here I am, a random guy from Nashua, New Hampshire. I'm blogging in my easy chair at home, and the newspaper calls and ends up on the front page, and I find myself in Washington, D.C. with one of these big tables of microphones. I literally said, I feel a little bit like Reese Witherspoon in Legally Blonde, you know? But when I worked in high-tech marketing, I learned how to give speeches that are tuned to the individual audience, so I made a go of it. I also was a hippie in the 1960s, anti-war kind of guy and all that, so I wanted social change. All right, so when the BMJ contacted me in 2013 and said, we think your story should be in the literature, all right, my antennas went up, said, okay, I'm good for that, but I also didn't want to just tell my story, right? I thought, doctors are going to read this. Right? And they might be somewhat influenced by what I say, but I asked my oncologist, David McDermott, what would you want other doctors? See, this is part of the art of social change, right? Getting trusted authority to speak up for you. I said, what would you want other doctors to know about my case? And he said, to my surprise, you were really sick. I don't know if you could have tolerated enough medicine if you hadn't been so well prepared. Now, what was he talking about there? right? He was talking about how I said, how do I prepare for these side effects? Instead of just waiting for something to happen. And as it happens, here we are at one of the best centers in the world for this cancer, Beth Israel Deaconess, and they said, that's a good question. Nobody has ever asked us that before. Now, careful here, because some people think empowered patients don't care about doctors, get out of my way, I want to do everything myself. Absolutely not the case. I was not out on the street corner asking for suggestions, what kind of chicken soup to eat or anything. But when the doctors didn't have answers, I didn't step back and go to sleep. I turned to the patient community. Notice also, my primary care physician didn't say stay off the internet. He showed me where to find the good stuff. Right? He was still my trusted guide. I turned to them and I got 16 firsthand stories of people who had been through this treatment with some idea of what to expect. Right? And I would not have asserted that this saved my life, but to my surprise, my oncologist thinks it helped. All right? And a really important point here is I'm all for the scientific method and the scientific literature, but the information they had is so obscure and individual, it would never justify a research grant, so it will never end up in the literature, even though it's valid. So you're starting to see here this picture opening up of this whole new world of paths to value, to survival, to better health. This is big news for me, right? In the past decade, or several decades actually, we have figured out what empowerment is and how to do it. Because, sometimes empowerment, people talk about patient empowerment, and it just seems like, oh, patients are so important. I've heard so many people say that at conferences. Now, what are you talking about? I'm an MIT graduate. I like to know what's the mechanism of action, the chain of events that makes things function well. So, turns out the World Bank has been studying women's empowerment around the world for decades. They had an answer, a definition that I used for a while, but just last December, lucky for me, they came out with a new framework. They say empowerment happens by removing constraints that are holding people back. Now, these people for decades have been going into villages around the world in developing areas. This is practical experience. And they say there are 3 categories. Agency. Now, this is an awkward word because to most people, an agency is not what they're talking about. This is the capacity for taking action, for goal setting, depending on your level of self-efficacy and self-esteem. Do you believe that you have the right to speak up and say what's important to you? And do you have the skills to take action? All right? Resources, the inputs, such as capital, assets. Now, for us, it's tools and information, right? Data and apps, right? That helps with patient empowerment. And context is an enabling environment. And what that really comes down to is social permission. The classic example here is if you are a woman living under the Taliban, it doesn't matter how much resources you have access to, you are not going to be empowered. Now, how does that play out for us? So remember, empowerment happens by removing constraints with these 3 big categories. And I get excited here because what we've been talking about and analyzing and brewing up is coming to a boil. All right, let's look at these constraints in history. I was in college when the women's movement came through Boston. And part of what was happening then is that the women's health movement was getting cranked up. This woman is Miriam Hawley. When she left Michigan in 1966 with her newborn son, her last visit to her OB/GYN, the doctor gave her a prescription and she said, "What's this for?" And he literally, I have met her, she's told me this story personally, he literally patted her on the head and said, "Don't you worry about that." All right? Now, I think it's good that as I look out over here, comparable number of men made noise to the number of women who did. And her point, what she says is, we wanted to worry about it, right? And when she got to Boston, she met up with some other friends, not having a say in our own healthcare, frustrated and angered us. We didn't see this agency. We didn't have the information we needed, so we decided to find it on our own. All right, whenever you find yourself facing one of those moments, I've got a problem, what am I going to do? You're experiencing that shift. And she and her friends got together and hand wrote a book of women's health information called Women and Their Bodies. And then they had this amazing shift after the first edition. They said, what are we talking about? Women and their bodies, third person. It's our bodies, ourselves. And they created this second edition of the book, which now has it's sold millions of copies around the world, where they defined what was important to them and got the information. So this is one example of that. Now, empowering context. I love this because, again, this happened in Boston where I was hanging out. 1967, the Boston Marathon, okay? This woman named Catherine Switzer just registered for the Boston Marathon just using her initial. She didn't know girls weren't allowed to register because everybody knows girls aren't athletic. And so this guy, the race organizer, literally tried to throw her out of the race. He said, get the hell out of my race. Well, her boyfriend, now her husband, blocked the guy out of the way, and she went on and finished. Not only that, turns out, she said later, her boyfriend was worried that she might really not be able to make the distance, but she beat his time. So that's it. Paternalism shows up in unexpected ways and places. But look what happened here, because here's where we're getting into the social attitudes in our industry can get in the way of or enable the change that we all want to see. So, 1967, she was supposedly not supposed to run because everybody knows girls aren't athletic. 5 years later, in the United States, a law called Title IX was passed that said half of federal funding for school sports had to go to girls. Well. The athletic director of my school quit, not because he hated women, but he said, this is nuts. Girls aren't athletic. They don't even sweat. Now, I have an enlightened woman friend who says he must be a lousy lover. Depends on your point of view, I suppose. But thank you, Luke. Having seen that shirt that you gave Rachel, I'm not worried about overstepping my bounds. 1972, ladies and gentlemen, a generation later, the U.S. women's team won the World Cup. You see what happens? In the World Bank framework, they had permission now, the enabling context, and they had resources, funding. It is a mistake, no matter how smart somebody thinks they are, it is a mistake to hold somebody back because you've never seen anybody like that do anything useful. All right, we are here at events like this to learn about these thought errors, thought opportunities. The real punchline that I love is 50 years after 1967, when she was 20, Catherine Switzer, wearing that same tag, ran the Boston Marathon at age 70, all right, and finished it again. So if that guy thought it was ridiculous for her to run it as a 20-year-old, he would have just lost his mind. What's going on now is patients are having similar experiences. Hey, I want to call the shots, all right? I don't want to reject doctors, but there was a wonderful book that came out last year called Rebel Health by my colleague, Susanna Fox. She was another one of those friends of Tom Ferguson, and we don't have time to go into it here, but if you're interested in this way of thinking of things, this is a 2x2 matrix that she put together of diseases, a space of disease, from whether your condition is invisible to the world or well-known, like diabetes, for instance, and whether your needs are well met or not. right? And she has these 4 quadrants. Again, we don't have time to go into this. But I will mention that there are situations where where the industry says, we have solved your needs, and the people down there, if you look at the bottom of the cover art, are saying, excuse me, I am not so sure that I'm thrilled with what you've done for me. All right, and that's where people are having that moment of saying, I want more, I want better. The best example of this that I know of is the We Are Not Waiting movement. Has anybody heard of this? It's a good, we have a couple of hands. People with type 1 diabetes who got tired of hearing year after year, another 5 years and we'll have an automatic pancreas for you or an artificial pancreas for you. And they said, screw it, we're gonna set out on our own. We've got data from our digital insulin pump and our glucose meters. Dana Lewis, this is her pancreas on the desk here. And we developed our own treatment system, open source, APS, automated pancreas system. And it's funny because her boyfriend, now her husband, was a programmer, and he started just guessing. He developed an algorithm and iterated it over a couple of years and got pretty darn good at automatically dosing her insulin. And it got to the point where they started tweeting with the openAPS hashtag, their glucose, their blood sugar is better controlled than somebody with a working pancreas. All right, and they wrote the software themselves. They didn't have any doctors supervising them. And here's where paternal thinking shows up and just makes people look dumb. Because the paternal people said, well, are you sure this is safe? And they said very diplomatically on their website, because our lives depend on this, the first thing we did was build in safety. Right? So, thanks for the paternal caring. Anyway, but there's another principle here called user-driven innovation. And, you know, the traditional way to build a car is you start with various things, and until it's all done, you don't get any happiness. You don't get a smiley face. But when users develop something for themselves, they start with a skateboard. Hey, this is fun. Hey, a scooter, and then a bicycle, and so on. Every step along the way, every enhancement is value added. And this is how they built that open APS. Initially, they thought there's no way I'd go running, you know, or have a meal while I'm running using this stuff. But it turns out it got better and better. So now you will meet paternal skeptics who say this is a bad idea, all right? Paternalism, it's important to understand, is not always bad. When a baby has no clue what's going on, it's important for people to protect them. Don't touch the stove, you'll burn yourself, all right? But when the kid gets wiser and develops more competence, then it's nuts to approach things that way. So now in 2010, people were saying, should patient school? Stay off the internet, there's crap out there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in 1999, I found my wife online on Match.com, but I promise you that before I found her, I went through some suboptimal search results, you know? So she's not in the room at the moment, but if you see her with me here, just say hi and congratulations, or I'm so sorry, or whatever you want to say. But the thing is, well-meaning paternal people can't imagine that we would know how to take care of ourselves, so we need to educate them. So, the Belgian government, I gave a talk in Brussels in 2013, and the following year, the Belgian government produced 2 big-budget TV commercials saying, don't Google it. This is a guy who had an owie on his finger, and while his wife was bandaging the owie on his finger, he Googled, and he ended up thinking he had this horrible condition with warts on his face and nosebleed. Incredibly, well, anyway, that was, but then also, this teen, 19-year-old teen, she had a stomach cancer, and she was cured. It started coming back, and her doctors in the NHS said, no, this cancer does not come back. And then they actually said, stop Googling. And so she and her mom stopped Googling, and she died. Turned out the patient community had said, yes, it does come back. Now we have, should patients use generative AI? The former CIO of my hospital said in his keynote at the HL7 annual meeting a year ago, it's just too early for us to give generative AI to patients and expect the results will be good. The very same day on the Today Show website was the story of this little kid who at age 3 had stopped developing properly. His right leg started dragging and so on. And the kid had suffered for 3 years while they went to 17 doctors. And eventually one night, the mom, a woman named Courtney Morales Hoffman, sat down with GPT. She was already AI savvy early in 2023. She apologized to her 6-year-old son for uploading his personal health information to the internet with an unknown company. She spent 4 hours, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., and by the time she was done, the most likely suspect appeared to be tethered cord syndrome. 2 weeks later, the doctors confirmed it, and 4 weeks later, he had the surgery. He's all better now. So let's see. All right, so I love this quote. In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that doesn't exist anymore. Right? That's why we come to meetings like this and have talks like this. Rachel, you're going to need to warn me, because otherwise I'll be going until drinks. I am coming to a close. You can flash the current time at me all you want, but I don't know what my countdown is. 10 minutes, okay, thank you. I think I can actually do that. Being curious about this history, okay? I published a piece, you may know the name Bertalan Meshko, the medical futurist is his social media persona, a hotshot doctor at Semmelweis in Budapest. And we did a timeline, which I can't walk through all of it here, but what I wanted, we submitted a paper, and I said, what's going on is there are 3 different categories of change. This wants to be a timeline of the history of patient empowerment. The pink is changes in the medical establishment. The green is social and cultural things, and the yellow or orange is technology, access to knowledge. And so starting back here, like in the 1980s and 1990s, the disability rights movement came up with this rallying cry. They're the source of the expression, nothing about us without us. All right, and ACT UP, AIDS patients demanding that researchers change their priorities. The US HIPAA privacy rule in 2003, and all of this. Now I'm going to slide this over here. There was the fiasco where I ended up yelling into a reporter's telephone, give me my damn data. And that became a thing. It was spotlight of my TED Talk. PCORI, patient-centered outcomes, all of these things. Notice what's happening as we get into the last 10 years. I'll slide it over one more time. All of a sudden, we have a lot of things happening that involve all 3 categories: changes in the medical establishment, changes in technology, all right? And that's why I said at the beginning, this is like just coming to a boil, and I tell you, new things are possible, and it is time for us, for this community, the FHIR community, for everybody to be thinking newly, what should we do if the rules and constraints are changing? The last one here on the right, just this year, this new hashtag, patients use AI. It's entirely predictable. The same paternal concerns about, wait a minute, patients are going to hurt themselves if they Google, right, are playing out again. And we are just returning those serves in the same way. Here's a simple example. In the US, we have this thing called Open Notes, where I can look at the doctor's visit notes after I have a doctor's appointment. And it's all full of all kinds of medical stuff, as you think it might be. I copy-paste that into ChatGPT, and I said, simplify this for me and tell me what my action items are. So what do they get? Problem. One of your problems is hypertension, and here's what your action items are for the entire thing. Now, you may not think, most people think about using GPT to say, where can I get the best hamburger? Something like that. But so we started a Substack blog called Patients Use AI. Sue Sheridan is a world-famous patient safety advocate. She had 2 tragedies in her family decades ago, and just this spring, she had a dentist appointment, and then a few days went by, and she had this new symptom come up where her face was drooping. She went to A&E at one hospital, and they did some tests and said, keep an eye on it. And she thought, this just doesn't seem right. So she went home, and even though she'd never touched GPT, she typed dental appointment, facial droop, blah, 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 and it said, looks likely to be Bell's palsy. And so she went back to another hospital, and they said, yes, that looks like it's what you've got. And the important thing is, if Bell's palsy isn't treated within 72 hours, it can become permanent. All right? Now, who wants to say patients should not use AI? James Cummings has become a friend. He is the parent of 2 rare disease kids. He is at the fringe of medical knowledge. All right? His doctors say, one of them is a 1 in a million or 10 million condition. There's just not much literature. So he's doing what he can to collect data. We'll come back to him in a couple of minutes. He did a post. One thing he did, even though he doesn't have all the software the future tools that he wants, is he's seeing 4 different hospitals within the Yale New Haven health system, all with their own Epic systems, and none of those doctors can see each other. I know the rumor is, the cultural myth is, Epics can all talk to each other. Well, in reality, they don't. So James copy-pastes all of the stuff into GPT and says, summarize this for me. And then he shows it to the doctors. All right, this blog post talks about the doctor looking back and forth between their Epic system and his phone. All right, patient empowerment, I love it. More nerd goosebumps. And just something here, teaching each other about how to write prompts that would be useful. And finally, Bert. Bert is a guy in Oregon. He says, I'm a mountaineer and a marketer. And he doesn't want to call himself a cancer patient, but he says, I happen to have 2 cancers. Indeed, he does. So he took his scan reports and pasted it into GPT. Here's the way the radiology report initially said, and he didn't have any fancy prompting, just typical doctor talk. And GPT put in boldface subheads to break it apart for him and simplified some of the language. And then he thought, yeah, I want to have some fun with this. I mean, could somebody give me a narrative, tell me what this all amounts to? And did you know that you can give these things, you can tell it what voice to speak in? You can say in the voice of the King James Bible, he chose Samuel L. Jackson. And he said, cussing is okay. Now, I do not have the full raw version that he eventually got. It took him 5 tries to make the things Anyway, impressions. Your liver tumors have gotten a bit bigger. We're going to watch it closely. All right? The pancreatic tumor, stable, baby, no major moves. All right, your right kidney tumor. Now, see, what doctor would think this is a meaningful thing to do? But the whole idea here is when the sick person has the keys to the car and can go wherever they want, who cares? Not doing any harm. It's not like he's running up the national health expenditure, right? And I love this last one where it says, go ahead, talk to your docs. Remember, ain't no surprises here. Just keep fighting like the badass you are. Like, he gets encouragement from it. But then look what he did. He's been keeping a symptom diary of his own, and he pasted all that stuff in there. Are you starting to see where some interesting health data standards might be a dream to us? All right, this is what he pasted in. And ChatGPT said, the format you've provided for tracking your symptoms is well-structured and detailed, which is helpful. All right, it praises him for doing all that stuff. He said, would you like me to analyze this data? And long story short, sure, here's the analysis, and here's the graph that the thing did. Now, this guy is not a nerd. He's not a programmer. He's a marketing guy, so he knows graphs, making graphs out of data and how useful they can be. And it found a new correlation that nobody'd seen before. I encourage you to learn from chronic patients. Chronic patients are ones who have gotten a diagnosis that said, you are not going to get better. All right? They are going to live with their condition for the rest of their life. They have ongoing management issues. Ask them, what would you like the system to do for you? Okay? Sarah Rigera in Stockholm is a wonderful example. She has Parkinson's, and this is her iconic graphic. That one red dot is the 1 hour of the year that she spends meeting with her neurologist, and the blue dots are the rest of the year. She wants to be empowered to self-manage, right? Anna McAllister works in health data policy in DC. She has these 5 categories that these are the things she keeps track of for lifestyle. She's doing it all manually right now herself. These are all the doctors she interacts with. Can you imagine having a life like this? She's type 1 diabetic with a couple of complications. These are her drugs. These are the lab results. And these are the devices that she's tracking. She has an enormous desire for tools to organize the data in ways that she finds important. And what's important in any given month may be different from last month. So on this blog, we have, James now, and this is my final closing appeal to you, what James wants. Right? What James wants for his kids is not just to see all the data, but in order to do what he's trying to do, he wants a longitudinal health record through the years, but he says not just longitudinal, you could call it latitude, I don't know, but also all the different hospitals he needs. But the problem is nobody with any of those Epic systems has any desire or any business case for making what he needs. He is a programmer. He is willing to pursue it. There are other people. And finally, Hugo Campos. This guy has been an e-patient for more than a decade. Here he was showing off his AliveCore, the iPhone EKG thing that he uses to manage his heart. And he is just way deep into wonderful, nerdy, good stuff with AI now. And when this was all new, the paternalists were saying, wait a minute, AI hallucinates, patients are going to hurt themselves. I said, Hugo, what do you think about this? He laughed. He said, Dave, I don't ask this stuff to give me answers. I use it to help me think. Right? And I've since heard doctors say this is how they're using GPT. Right? I don't ask it for an answer and assume that's correct. So I call this Hugo's Law. I'm a blogger. I can declare laws if I want to. Anyway, his 95-year-old father was living with him. I can't read that back there, but I assume it means I have to stop. Living with him and came up with a horrible rash. And so while they're waiting to see the consultant, he typed in all the information he had, and he asked GPT to do a differential diagnosis with 4 columns. Just to see what he might learn. And to make a long story short, he noticed that recommended actions had a lot of things in common. So while waiting for the consultant, they tried that, and it worked. All right? This is what Hugo likes to call autonomy, the ability to take things in whatever direction he wants without bothering the doctors. And that's what he blogged. And this is the potential. If we can give people like this the ability to create data storage that is what they want for their purposes without bothering anyone else, the paternalists, of course, will say, that's too complicated. Right? But watch. Come back in 5 or 10 years and see what we do. So I am, and his big post here about the future, a fantasy, is about having a healthcare agent a few years from now, right, that will have access to all his relevant information and will help him run his own healthcare. So here's a parting thought, folks. Any chance we could do something to create something like a patient autonomy work group? Or, I don't know what I'm asking for, but I know there are people who want it. So thank you for everything you're doing. This is what we have in mind.